Mamdani has now delivered that diversity and optimism and hope, as he called it, to a diverse city.
This is proof of concept for the Democrats that a strong national security message in some of these suburban states, paired with potentially a more progressive set of voices in places like New York, can bring record numbers of voters to the polls.
This gives Trump an incredibly powerful incentive to do whatever he can to affect the outcome of the 2026 election. And that includes things like trying to suppress the vote in Democratic districts.
Hello again. Welcome to Independent Thinking, the international affairs podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox in the US this week, where New York has a new mayor-elect. Socialists ran the headlines in right-wing newspapers, at least this week, after the young, progressive, and telegenic Democrat Zohran Mamdani won New York City's mayoral election. Mamdani, who's the son of Indian-American filmmaker Mira Nair and a Harvard and Columbia-educated scholar of colonialism, became the first Muslim mayor in the city's history and one of its youngest for generations. It was also a night for Democrat triumph in governor races in New Jersey and Virginia, and in a crucial vote in California on whether the governor could adjust the boundaries of seats to help Democrats. All that raises questions about whether this is the start of a Democratic revival of the kind that has been conspicuously absent during President Trump's second term. Well, Mamdani himself can't go on to be president, mostly because he was born abroad in Uganda. That rule still stands, but also because no New York mayor has ever done it. The city's uniquely diverse and liberal electorate makes it an historically poor launching board for national politics at the highest level. Many have tried, but no one has emulated what Boris Johnson managed in the UK and gone from being Mayor of London to the highest office. But what Mamdani may represent is a generational shift in the aging leadership of the Democratic Party and a progressive spearhead, perhaps, against his fellow New Yorker in the White House. President Trump, born and raised in Queens, immediately called him a communist and threatened to withhold federal funds from my beloved first home. So the battle lines are drawn. The country and the world are watching to see how this affects American politics, what it means for left-wing or radical politicians across the globe. With me to discuss all this, Laurel Rapp, director of our US and North America program at Chatham House, and hailing from New York's neighboring state, New Jersey, and Bruce Stokes, an associate fellow at Chatham House, former director of global economic attitudes at the Pew Research Center. We've also got Steve Farrell, who's head of our news and comment team, who reported on previous mayoral election in New York for the New York Times. Welcome to you all. Let's start straight off with this. Why Mamdani won? He promised the moon, all kinds of things. Bruce, what do you reckon really tipped it for voters?
One, he's a change candidate, and I think increasingly American voters want change. And he promised to attack issues that people say are first and foremost in their minds, that of economic affordability, promised to freeze rents in rent-controlled apartments, promised free childcare till the age of 5, to open some city-run grocery stores and hold down food prices. So he made some promises, some of which he can't keep, I think, or it will be very difficult to keep. But this is what galvanized people. And what, of course, is important is that the turnout in this election was the highest in a mayoralty race since 1969. So he energized people, especially young people, it would appear, which is something the Democratic Party nationwide has needed to do in the last couple of elections.
And Laurel, do you think it matters to those voters, or do they recognize that he may not be able to deliver all this?
Mamdani has set forward a very ambitious agenda, and one that will be, as Bruce says, fairly hard to effectuate. But he struck a rather conciliatory tone in the last weeks of the campaign, but then was very clear the day after that he had an agenda. This is what voters elected him to do, and he would prosecute that agenda. And the big question is how he will fund a lot of the very ambitious economic affordability agenda items, as Bruce mentioned, free childcare before 5, free buses, rent control. These will be very expensive initiatives. They're very popular ones, but he had previously said maybe they'll have existing revenue to fund this, although he is now looking more at sort of taxes on the ultra wealthy, which has rankled many in certain parts of New York City.
Yes, rankled feels a bit of an understatement. There's been some pretty searing comments from the masters of the universe, as I guess we don't call them anymore, but the finance chiefs and others working in what is one of New York's and the US's most successful industries. Bruce, how would that work if he proposed wealth taxes and so on? Can't people just, much as they may love Manhattan and the boroughs nearby, just move to the states adjacent?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the tax rate that he has suggested on corporations, for example, would be comparable to that in New Jersey. So it's not as if people can move across the river and get a lower tax rate. But there's also the issue that the governor of New York and Albany, the seat of the state government, can override what the city might do on taxes. And the current governor of New York has already promised to do that if he tries to raise taxes. So there's going to be a real tug of war here, at least. And he may not be able to deliver on that higher tax rate, which means that, as Laurel mentioned, funding all of these promises will be quite difficult. So my guess is that what we'll do is we'll see an implementation of things he has control over, but a fight with Albany, a delay in some of the other fundraising that he will need to do all of the things he's promised.
He's also in for a fight, not just with Albany, but with Washington. There are federal programs and funds that do flow to New York, less than for some other states. But we have seen President Trump use federal assistance to states and to cities as leverage to prosecute his own agenda. And the president has already threatened to do that as Mamdani rolls out his economic proposals.
Yeah, a fight with Washington, meaning a fight with President Trump in this particular case. And he obviously, as he has said, has a particular passion for New York.
And they both seem eager to pick a fight with one another. This is President Trump's hometown. It is where he has significant real estate and business holdings. And he has been particularly invested in this race in New York, campaigning very heavily against Mamdani, but not necessarily supporting the alternatives. And we saw that in a very late endorsement that President Trump offered to the independent candidate, former Democratic candidate Cuomo. And the result was a very soft showing at the polls for Cuomo.
Steve, you've covered a previous mayoral race. What does it look like that New York has now elected a 34-year-old Muslim?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's no surprise that New York was going to go Democratic. I mean, I think Kamala Harris beat Trump by 36 percentage points, I think, in the city. But what's extraordinary, beyond the policy and beyond the details, which will be hammered out between the city and the national level in the coming years, is Mamdani is a creature of his era. He is a social media native. And in many ways, that's often been the case in New York history. He is in the modern social media era with his TikTok videos of shouting, "I'm going to freeze rents," and then jumping in the freezing cold waters of Coney Island on New Year's Day. It was appealing, it was attractive, and he openly welcomed, embraced almost the criticism from Wall Street, from the financial titans, and there was a lot of criticism from pro-Israel groups as well, who are quite nervous about him. But really, he is, in the modern era, what maybe Fiorello LaGuardia was in the 1930s. You know, he mastered the tabloid front pages. He mastered the WNYC radio address to the people. Bill de Blasio mastered YouTube. I mean, he basically soared to victory on YouTube videos of himself and his diverse family. And Mamdani has now delivered that diversity and optimism and hope, as he called it, to a diverse city.
And it is diverse, but as you said, there was a big Jewish vote and have been in the past. I'm thinking of closer to 9/11, a lot of concerns about Muslim voters. Does this really mean we're in a different era?
So for me, I had a very interesting moment. My very first interview I ever did in a New York mayoral campaign. It was when Bill de Blasio eventually won about a decade ago. I rolled into a Republican club in Staten Island and got off my motorbike, obviously British accent, covering a New York mayoral election. They said to me, "Oh, you're from London," and some fairly Islamophobic stuff followed. And I sort of blinked hard and deflected and thought, where did that come from? And then it came at me again and again in sort of blue-collar clubs, Republicans mostly across Queens, parts of Brooklyn, Staten Island. And you thought, okay, well, these are Fox News talking points. And then 2 or 3 years later, along comes Trump, channeling this stuff, clearly having listened. And you realized, oh, he's picked up on this and he's weaponized this. So he did, and I'm sure he will again.
What we tend to forget is there are now almost as many Muslims living in New York City as there are Jews. So the tension between these two populations was really at a fever point in this election. The number of my liberal, progressive Jewish friends who thought that Mamdani's statements about Hamas were just horrible and anti-Semitic, etc. At the same time, you had Islamophobic ads being run that were really horrendous. So one of the things to watch going forward will be the tensions between these two very large populations, about 1 million people each, who live in New York City.
A different era then in many, many ways, and the city itself has changed. Laurel, I wonder if you can take us into the gubernatorial races, the governor races, because these were, again, candidates very much recognizing people's concern about the cost of living, but much more moderate than Mamdani.
The Democrats have been working to build a big tent over the past months for these elections, and we've seen that bear out successfully in these races. So, if Mamdani is the far left tentpole from New York, we have two moderate Democratic governors who were elected from New Jersey and Virginia. These are women with strong national security credentials. Mikey Sherrill, the governor elect of New Jersey, a former military, and then Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, a former Central Intelligence Agency officer. These are both strong states with large suburban populations. They are pushing forward a moderate campaign agenda, but have also echoed some of the affordability challenges that Mamdani has referenced in New York. And that really seemed to resonate with voters. And they came out in droves to elect these women who were first brought to Congress in 2018 during the first Trump presidency, during the big sweep in the midterms, 2 years after Trump came into power. They were roommates in Washington when they were here serving. They know each other very well. And they're part of this cohort of national security women who are running and will be running in next year's midterm as well. And this is proof of concept for the Democrats that a strong national security message in some of these suburban states, paired with potentially a more progressive set of voices in places like New York, can bring record numbers of voters to the polls.
So I think you put it very well there, but including, as you said, the real recognition of affordability. Bruce, just going on to this wider question of whether this is a Democrat revival, is this a weak spot for President Trump that he hasn't delivered what he promised on affordability of life?
Well, certainly on affordability. The president continues to contend in interviews and in speeches that inflation is down when in fact the data suggests it's up. It has slowed, but is still growing. And those reassurances are ringing hollow with many voters, it would appear. Whether the president can now pivot against his own message up to the election day, which was there's nothing to worry about here, the economy's doing well, remains to be seen. I mean, stock market's still going very well, so the corporate sector is fairly optimistic. I think one of the interesting issues going forward between now and the 2026 congressional elections will be, will the economy continue to stay pretty strong? Will inflation go up because of these tariffs, which would impact affordability for average voters very directly? And is there a break in the stock market? We have a stock market that is doing very well, but it's really based on 6 or 7 companies. And when we have had these kinds of stock market booms that were so concentrated in one sector of the economy, we've come to regret that, and there's been a downturn. So if that happens before the election, that'll make the affordability issue even harder for the Republicans to sell and buoy the chances of the Democrats.
Yeah, and obviously not all Americans are exposed to the stock market in the sense of having retirement accounts there or other shareholdings. So would I be right in saying from these elections, there is a message to Trump that you've got to care about the affordability and the inflation, even if that hasn't been as bad as economists were forecasting when his tariffs came in, that he's got to pay some attention to that?
No, I think he will have to. The criticism from some Republicans yesterday, the day after the election, was that the president was spending too much time on international things and not focusing enough on the home front. American presidents tend to do that in their second term. And certainly the president had an international agenda in the last month or so that was pretty focused. One of the interesting things to look at is, does he pull back now on these threats to Venezuela, the new threats to Nigeria, which make him look like a tough guy in his mind, but on the other hand, would suggest to average Americans that he's not focused on their issues, he's focused on something else.
Yes, I thought the Vice President, J.D. Vance, was careful. He didn't say you've spent too much time chasing after the Nobel Peace Prize, but he did say pretty acerbically, you've got to focus at home. How did you read those comments, Laurel?
President Trump has spent a fair bit of time abroad in the last weeks and months, and that has also become a Democratic talking point. The night of the election, Hakeem Jeffries, the House minority leader, was on the cable news networks and said, Trump has spent more time talking to Hamas and the Chinese Communist Party than he has to Democrats in Washington to end the shutdown. And so this is going to be a line of attack that is only going to grow as the shutdown shows no signs of abating. When the president has been focusing at home, too, the message has not been as disciplined potentially as some Republicans would like. A lot of the focus of these elections was on affordability. The president hosted a very large Halloween party that was Great Gatsby themed, rebuilding the East Wing for a large ballroom. These are also offering talking points to Democrats to say, at a time when the president is hosting lavish gatherings, he is also cutting off food assistance to millions of hungry Americans because of the government shutdown. And so that messaging discipline has also been undercutting what the president might want to be focused on right now.
I love that phrase, talking points, is what in British politics would be missiles to be hurled across the aisle. Steve, do you think this focus on foreign rather than home is now a vulnerability for Trump?
It does seem to be a point of vulnerability at the moment, but these things change and change quickly. A short time ago, people were saying he's going abroad to bask in glory and get away from Jeffrey Epstein. So what I would say is that Trump pivots extremely quickly and extremely well and is adept at exploiting divisions. The Democrats have to unite the Mamdani coalition, if you like, with more moderate members of their own party, more centrist, in order to win. Trump really just has to exploit divisions. And I would probably back him to be better at exploiting divisions than the Democrats have so far recently shown they are at uniting their own disparate base.
Laurel, this bigger question as well, then, of looking ahead to next year's midterm races, is this a Democrat revival, or what should the Democrats do with this information they have from these elections?
This week's elections were a strong opening volley for the midterms. It gives Democrats a lot of data points on how to build a message, sustain a message, to put candidates forward who are strong. One of the other takeaways from this race, from these series of races, is that strong candidates win elections. And so I think we'll see a focus on that over the next couple of months. And President Trump remembers well what a divided government feels like and looks like. He had 2 years before he had to deal with a divided Congress. And he remembers the investigations, the subpoenas, the impeachments. And it really does imperil this White House's and this president's ability to prosecute an agenda with fewer checks on its executive authority and power. And that may be coming next year.
If I could jump in here, Speaker of the House Johnson said out loud what Laurel just said. He said yesterday in an interview that if the Democrats regain control of the House of Representatives, Trump will be impeached. And I think he's probably right about that. So this gives Trump an incredibly powerful incentive to do whatever he can to affect the outcome of the 2026 election. And that includes things like trying to suppress the vote in Democratic districts through intimidation, through lawsuits, through attempts to influence how the votes are counted. There's going to be real challenges to the democratic process in the United States in this 2026 election.
A really interesting point to look out for. And Laurel, just incidentally, also going on this week, a different kind of battle, the Supreme Court considering this really central point of whether Trump has the right as president to impose tariffs or whether that is taking away crucial congressional power. And some conservative members of the court have been saying things that are not to Trump's liking. How significant could this be?
This is one of the signature cases that the Supreme Court will be hearing this year on one of President Trump's signature policy initiatives. Trump has gone out very strong on tariffs early on, hoping and expecting maybe that the courts will uphold this as constitutional. The justices have seemed skeptical in the last day as the hearings began. What we expect is that even if the courts do strike down the tariffs as non-constitutional, the president will find other ways to use a series of other tariff measures to try to effectuate a similar outcome. It will be more chaotic. It will be harder for other governments and companies to understand the direction of these tariffs. But from an intention perspective, we don't expect the president's interest on these tariffs to wane, both as a way to coerce other governments to offer concessions as he negotiates trade deals, but also as a way for raising national revenue for the Treasury.
I mean, I'm sure that is right in that Trump, who has been wedded to the idea of tariffs for a very long time, won't lose his interest in it. But it is, as you said, an absolutely crucial point, which the court is considering, of whether the president has this power or whether it is taking away power from Congress. And as Neil Gorsuch, one of the conservative-leaning justices or conservative-appointed justices, said, look, power once taken by the executive is not going to flow back to Congress. And so they are considering it very seriously. And it is something that other courts as well around the world looking at these tariffs are looking at. Let's just go to the wider question finally of what the world should make of this. After many years of looking at the US, I'm very conscious of how other countries can misinterpret it, can take the wrong messages, both about where the US is going or indeed themselves. London Mayor Sadiq Khan was delighted to see Mamdani's election and said all kinds of exultant things. But I'd love from the three of you just a sense of what someone sitting in another country should make of this. Do these elections tell us a lot about where the US is going, or is that yet to be seen? Bruce?
Well, I think it's too early to make any definitive conclusion. I do think that on one hand, we know that in the past, Americans have believed that we are the shining city on the hill, Ronald Reagan's phrase that he took from a Puritan sermon, that everybody looks up to us and our democracy. In fact, the studies that have been done by the Pew Research Center around the world show that in many parts of the world, especially Europe, people do not look up to our democracy. They don't think it's doing very well. And in Asia, even now, people say, yeah, we think your democracy is okay, but we think you're also very divided. So there's a sense, I think, that they will look at this 2026 election to see if, in fact, American democracy lives up to its ideals. And what we know is that for the first time ever, there are states, multiple states, that are redrawing the lines for congressional races in the run up to an election in the middle of a decade, which has not happened before. This looks like manipulation of the outcome and will be a blow, I think, to the soft power of the United States as a leading light of democracy.
Well, it's an interesting point, and there have been others, which we don't need to dwell on in this podcast. But the world's views of the US have been given cause to change, or at least to be reconsidered quite a lot. this year, but actually over previous years as well, and Biden, Joe Biden contributed to that as well. Laurel, what's your view? You're in the US at the moment, but you're with us in London. What do you make of this? What the world should see in these elections?
So many that I've spoken with outside of the United States have asked, where are Americans? Where are the American people on the direction they want their country to go? And I think they have seen a relative absence, or they have said to me, an absence of opposition, of resistance, of the sort of levels of activity against the Trump administration's approach that many around the world saw in the first Trump term. They did not see that as much this time around. And they wondered why. And they wondered if something about the nature of the United States had changed. And I think this offers some initial data points to those who wonder where Americans are. The forms that this will take will look different as time goes on, but I think we've seen across the electorate over the past days, and we may see it next year, that there are a wide swath of Americans who do not support the direction that this president has taken, both national and foreign policy, and that they will be making their voices heard, maybe not the way they did last time around, but at the ballot box.
I'm sure that's right. On the other hand, the point I don't want to lose is that Trump and MAGA, the Make America Great Again movement, didn't come out of nowhere. And we started this conversation very much talking about the cost of living, the rage of many people of feeling left behind in the British phrase, perhaps those who don't have an investment in the stock market. Steve, what's your sense? As the world is very much in danger of thinking at any sign, oh, the America we want to see is back in some sense.
One thing we are seeing is that Donald Trump does appear to be rattled, and that will have been noticed. He was quite adept at slipping out of the Super Bowl when before his team lost, because he doesn't like being associated with defeat. But I couldn't help but notice that on this one, he was right in there, almost up to the last minute, pushing his favoured losing candidates who went on to lose. He's made it difficult not to own this defeat, I think. He could have stepped away, but I think he's got used to winning, and now he hasn't won. And I think not only his domestic opponents, but those abroad might notice that vulnerability. I noticed, for instance, on his Truth Social feed, he pivoted from saying, "You've got to turn out to defeat my opponents," to "Your Thanksgiving dinner will cost you less," and end the filibuster. He's really aware of his vulnerabilities and trying to address them very, very quickly in the aftermath of these defeats. Internationally, we are seeing obvious glee almost among those on the left. In Britain, you mentioned London's Mayor Sadiq Khan, who said New York has faced a clear choice between hope and fear. And just like we've seen in London, hope won. We've seen Germany's The Left Party being very positive about Mamdani. We've seen others coming out. We have seen in Israel the exact opposite. I noticed the former Israeli ambassador to London called it the Corbynization of the Democrats, referring to Jeremy Corbyn's perceived support for those opposed to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So the international community is responding much as you would expect. The difference being this is not a Trump of his first year who's won everything and trailing clouds of electoral glory. This is a damaged Trump.
Laurel, I'm reaching for this point about whether the Make America Great Again spirit is really something that will endure, that many Americans support.
President Trump has latched on to a very deep undercurrent in the United States of feeling a sense of isolation and alienation from sort of central power structures. And he has built a platform that resonates with a large swath of Americans, but he also has a unique personalistic ability to drive that agenda in a way that a successor may not have the same ability to promote. We don't know what his successor will look like. We don't know who this will be, but Trump has been a uniquely capable messenger for this large swath of Americans who want to see a different politics in Washington.
Well, thank you all very, very much. Much to keep looking at in these races, but you've given us a warm up for looking ahead at next year. Next week on Independent Thinking, unless there is some huge further upset in the world, as there is quite frequently at the moment. We are going to be talking about Ukraine in a lot of detail, and I really look forward to that. Do join us for that. And a great thank you to my guests, Laurel Rapp, Bruce Stokes, Steve Farrell. See you next week.